I like it. I'm missing, I have to say this has been it's been a challenging week. Um, but tonight, so just talking, and this will get into just talking. As I mentioned last week, I had this woman who was like my second mother, and her birthday was actually Friday. That was her birthday. And I just give myself space because I know there's a emotional, it's only been 4 years. And for somebody that was a part of, especially somebody that's part of your formative years. And again, I was just commenting to a friend who lost her sister, and she was saying how different this grief was compared to her mother. And it's like, well, first of all, anybody in your inner circle is going to knock you on your feet. And so you have to, anyways, I'm just saying. So this last week, part of this has been, you know, trying to be gentle with myself. But tonight, as you may have seen over the last week, I have been posting about, because there's lots of stuff to do with death and dying, that if you are not in a culture that talks about it, and if you're not in a family that talks about it, such as mine was, then it leaves a lot of different things choices, decisions that you have to make. I think last week I talked about my dad, and when he had 3 strokes, and there's 6 blood vessels that go into your brain. 3 of them were plugged, blocked, and that was not the way he wanted to live. But we had this conversation ages ago. So you know what that does for us as his children? We didn't have to make that emotional decision, right? Um, he made the choice. We honored the choice. So let's get into all that other stuff. So when my dad passed away, he had no will. He had, as I mentioned before, he had nothing. So there was 44 line items. So part of this process is having to set up a funeral or a viewing or a whatever, some sort of community. And I do want to advocate for a community gathering because we need to support each other. We are human beings. We are social animals. And I know that coming from any kind of Irish anything, it's really great if you can bust a yarn about somebody and the funny story that happened, through your life, and you can celebrate their life. But the other side of it is, after all of that stuff, is my dad, again, not having a will. He dealt with every single bank in the city. There was 44 line items. And most people, when they think of death and dying, they think, oh, do you have a will? Well, there's also something called the living will, or your medical. You can have a property power of attorney, and you can have a medical power of attorney. So do you have people that are making your medical decisions? Because sometimes people are not emotionally prepared to make that choice to say, no, do not resuscitate, or, we don't want to go on life support. And so you need to be able to emotionally handle that at a time where it doesn't matter. I'm pretty sure, I've not had children, but I'm pretty sure it's close to childbirth, that you can read all the books you want, and you can even have all the training you want. But it's not, when it happens, it just takes over all of you. So having these 44 line items, I had to call these people, and it was like, I probably talked to 100 people. So just when it comes to a will, out of those 100 people, because I had to say, no, yes, I have a death certificate. Yes, I have, all this stuff. No, I don't have a will. And we have to be able to provide them. And this was information that was given to me by one of the many banks. I could tell you, I could go through the banks in this city and judge them or rate them on the way that they deal with somebody who's grieving. And out of all of the banks, and I mean all of them, there was 2 banks. One of them that had the least amount of money took the most amount of time to explain to me about what it is that I could do to make this process easier, because they were looking to mitigate the risk, because they don't want to give out, some sort of payment when there might be somebody that's contesting the will. There's a whole bunch of other stuff. So this place that literally had $250 took the time to explain to me how I could better deal with these other banks. Unfortunately, the bank with the most amount of money was horrible, just horrible. And so every time you've got to go in, and then it's like, oh, here we go again. And you're already in a place where you're emotionally drained. That's not the part I want to talk about. During this process, I talked to at least 100 people. Out of those, and we're talking people with children, people that own property, maybe, so out of 100 people, maybe this many had wills. And I was talking to, I can't tell you how many people. And like, I'm guessing 100. And through this, because as I mentioned before, I wrote a chapter on the difference between my stepfather passing away with my mom taking care of him, but my mom didn't set up a funeral. She had nothing done. So we show up at the front door and she comes out and she's like, oh, it's just dawned on me that you might not have seen a dead body. And it's like, well, Mom, where would I see a dead body? And more importantly, my two nieces are on their way over who are now 8 and 10. And I think maybe we should do something about said body that's in the living room, basically, because she cared for him at home. So we ended up getting on the phone. And in our family, this was funny. At the end of the night, when we finally did get a funeral home, and they came rather quick. And the great part was the doctor was able to come back quickly. We could laugh at that. But these are the kinds of things that you need to make sure, if these things are in play and those choices are made. So the difference between that, where there was a will, but the arrangements were set, to my dad who had nothing. And the third was my mom, because by the time we got to my mom, everything was picked out. The funeral home, it was prepaid. We didn't have to make any decisions. And it just emotionally allows you to breathe a little bit more. So as I wrote this chapter, I was having interesting conversations with university educated people. And the one person literally started the conversation by going, now I don't want you to freak out because I know, but she goes like, my parents, because you're writing this book, I went to my parents and we were just talking about it. And they sort of just dropped on us that, oh, well, I guess we should do our will again. Well, their will was from, I would say, the early 70s when they had 2 children. They now had 4 and a whole bunch of property. And you know what? Legally, those 2 children would be the only ones that would get anything. Unless you have a wonderful family. And by this, I mean, nobody's going to fight or bicker over money and who wants what and who's got what. No matter what's being said outside of that. And this kind of stuff, I look and it's like, I'm not freaking out. I just can't understand how, and again, this is where I really started to understand how much of a blessing it is that we can at least talk about this stuff, that we could at least, that I could say to my mom, in fact, we did this as a family. So Mom, like, where were you happiest? Where would you like now, all of us in our family, we want to be cremated. So where would you like your ashes to go? What would you like done with those? What brings you joy? What would bring you joy? And so we were able to have those conversations. So at least when that process was done, it was meaningful. But it's like, there's so many people that they can't even have that conversation with their parents. So then let's get into going into a funeral home, for instance, and you're looking at caskets. And say, one of the last conversations you had with your mom, you had a fight about something because you didn't think it would be the last time you talked to her. And there's a $30,000 oak casket. And this is real. This is like, that could be a new car. That's the equivalent of these prices. So like my mother, again, no, we don't want anything to do with, we don't want you spending any money on anything that's going into the ground. The Muslim faith, that choice is done because it's a pine box and that's it. So, these kinds of choices really show. And I know I remember I talked to somebody at work, and they were talking about, well, I don't want to talk about that with my kids. And it's like, well, do you love them? Yeah. Well, why would you want to leave them making those kinds of choices when they're grieving you, they're missing you, and And it's funny because it's about the whole band-aid thing. But getting back to things about, because there are people, and again, most people, I have to say, anybody in these funeral homes, in the funeral industry, they're absolutely compassionate, empathetic people. They're fabulous. But they're also going to offer you, because sometimes people, yeah, you want to be buried in a piano, for sure. There's actually, again, you can get a home funeral. You can do a home funeral where you can get your beloved uh, out of the hospital, bring them to your home, uh, transfer the body. And again, you would put it in a cardboard box, and you would decorate the cardboard box. So if somebody wants to draw flowers with crayons on it, they do that. You want to stick pictures that remind you of your life, you decorate the coffin with, the box with whatever you want. So, but for people that aren't accustomed to even dealing with like a body or the thought of a body, um, that's not even a conversation that can be had. So in a lot of ways, the business about it and the dignity around it. And so I'm popping into a bunch of different things, because as we can see here, there is so much more than just having a will. It's, what is your quality of life? Do you want to have a DNR, a do not resuscitate? Do you have a living will? What happens if you get into a catastrophic accident? Because I can tell you, those are professionals, our frontline workers. Their job is to keep you alive, unless you dictate otherwise. And as I said previously, if that person, you want to have a conversation with anybody that's going to be your medical POA, because they need to be able to have the courage to actually follow through with other people's wishes. Because, you know, when we're talking about quality of life, because there's also MAID, I posted something about the MAID legislation, which is just going on right now, which is the medical assistance in death. And a lot of people seem to think that, you know, uh, I guess when you've not been involved in the process of watching somebody with dementia or Alzheimer's go through that process, you don't know how painful it is for everybody. And that, um, you know, basically dementia or Alzheimer's, you go to the point where you don't remember how to swallow, you don't remember how to breathe. That's no way to go. We're kinder to our animals. We're kinder to our animals. And so it's really funny when um, the thing is that we have people that are making decisions that are um, emotionally exploitive at a time when really there should be compassion and empathy. And so this is where, like, again, I know I've just jumped through a whole bunch of different areas, but uh, having a home funeral is can be so beautiful. I know that being with my mother up until she died, I love that. I have a picture of her at the end. I don't look at that picture, because whatever was said was said, and I feel very blessed about that. As we pointed out last week, there's not all the time that we can have those kind of relationships. So this is like, you need to clean up your closet as you're going through life, right? Because we will all be leaving this world. But and it does make it challenging, but the business of it, and if you are in areas where your customer service, just keep in mind, if somebody tells you, oh, here's the death certificate, please don't act like it's, and while lots of people say, I'm sorry for your loss, you know, I'm going to use this, using a little common, just something that happened recently. Megan McCain on The View. I don't know if you guys watch The View, but she's just had this baby. When you've been with somebody and they're going through the dying process, and you've been able to bear witness to that, and you've been fully present, it's a gift. But it pushes your heart, it pulls your heartstrings in ways that you didn't even imagine. And so and once you've gone through that process, you do know it's like, okay, mom, if we can do this for you, we're going to make it happen. And that's what we did as a family. But it was never, this is what she said, this is what we did. So you need to be able to have those conversations. You don't want to be having it because unfortunately, somebody has a DNR and there's one person in the family that disagrees with that, it's gone. So you need to have these things in writing. You need to have a medical POA in writing. It's best to have your will in writing. There's certain things that, if you have, if you have property, stuff like that, it goes through a pecking order, right? But it's just really important to be able to make those choices before somebody else has to make them for you. So I know I have flipped around quite a bit, but yeah. So getting back to the maid, the reason it's so important is because anybody that's got Alzheimer's in their family, what's coming down the pipe. So you want to be able to, like, I know that I love anybody that I can do to support that. And I am somebody's medical POA because the people in their life may not be able to make that choice when it comes to it. Right? And there's nothing wrong. This is not a sign of weakness or anything else. It just has to do with, for instance, you can have really educated people, but it comes down to their parents. And if they've not been trained, I get that back to my mom when she came out on the front porch and it just dawned on me that you might not have seen a dead body. Well, mom, where would I have seen a dead body? And where would my nieces have seen a dead body? And that's what she did. That was her life. That was her training. So it's just like, if we have an EMTs, anybody, paramedics, fire, don't ask them questions about that part of their life. Boy, it must have been hard. Like, don't ask those questions because those answers, how they deal with that, how they process that is part of their training. It may not be something that's a conversation for everybody else, but boy, it would be a lot easier for all of us if we could make that emotional communication more acceptable. So that's the part in the beginning, because just like Megan McCain, she's had this baby and now she thinks everybody should have maternity leave because it's really hard having a baby. Meanwhile, before she's like, oh, so this is sort of the thing. Once you go through that process, you really want to be able to support people wherever you can, and give yourself a break. And I know this is your wheelhouse, so any thoughts? I know.
I mean, there's so much to talk about. It's not cut and dry, and it's not easy, and there's so many things that come up in these discussions. So I appreciate that you touched on a bunch of those things, and I also just want to acknowledge the anniversary of your loved one, and you're dealing with that as well through this month that we're talking about death and dying. I think what I want to add around this is just around the emotional element of it, and I wanted to speak a little bit from my own experience of being a death denier up until a couple of weeks ago. Not, you know what I mean, not a denier as such, but as someone who wasn't able to look at it, who wasn't able to really deal with it in any kind of a meaningful way. And this process has just been so healing for me. So, of course, thank you, Glenda, for suggesting this topic for this month. It really has been very eye-opening and very healing, and also very comforting for me. I do know, though, that prior to this, it's been difficult to talk about those things. Those of us who still have parents, those of us who are concerned about the health and welfare of our seniors, and the things that we know are there are eventualities for everyone, but may come upon a senior sooner than later. Those are things that we do want to be able to talk about. And I think that it is very important to take the time to acclimate yourself with the idea of death, right? Just whatever that looks like. And, it's not something that you're going to be able to do in a day or 2 days or 3 days. And even though I have a certain comfort level with it now that I didn't have before, it doesn't mean that everything is resolved for me. I know that it's an ongoing process, and it's something that I'm committed to working on for myself, right? And I think that, these are the things is to think about the emotional element of it, but balance that out with also the critical thought around it, right? Is to really be able to create that space for yourself where you're not just looking at it from a single point of view, you're looking at it actually from a holistic point of view. You're looking at it from your own point of view, what you're going to experience, what you're thinking about, what you're feeling, but also think about, what about my loved one? What would they want? What would be helpful for them? What would be comforting for them? How do I support them in this way? If they're not comfortable talking about it and you're not comfortable talking about it, well, what's going to happen? Nobody's going to talk about it. And then when it happened, it's going to be even more stressful. So you want to think about this like you're actually doing something that's going to be self-caring for you, for your family, for your loved one, if you find a way to engage it that actually makes sense for you. And what you might want to do prior to, anything happening. Like for me, I've been doing some reading. I've been watching some documentaries. I've been really doing the kind of thing that helps me to understand this from a number of different levels in terms of what people experience when they have to go through the loss of someone that's very close to them. And I think that it doesn't matter what people say, it doesn't matter what kind of advice you get. Everyone is going to deal with these things very differently. And so it's important to have your own awareness of what you are going through or what you may be going through, and to prepare yourself for that. Because even when you try and have a conversation with someone around their wishes, they may be so resistant to it that they don't have that conversation, right? So then what do? You have to find some way, some kind of contingency to be able to deal with whatever comes after that. If you have siblings, if you have other people around you, like have a conversation with them, at least get the other people on the same page, try and pull together as a group to do that. It's not always easy. People have contentions, people have their own opinions. It's not going to be an easy thing. The most important thing that anyone can do for themselves through this process is to be very grounded in what you feel for yourself, what you believe, how you feel you can be supportive. There are going to be times where you'll have to step up. There are also going to be times where you're going to have to step back because someone else's grieving is going to take over that process. And this is not about butting heads. It's not about, I need to take a hold of this, right? I watched a documentary recently where they showed two families where the two mothers were on life support.
Mm.
And they were showing the experiences of these two families. One of them uh, didn't want her to suffer, and they knew that she already had a DNR, right? And so they didn't want to lose her, but in a very short period of time, like within a month, that's a pretty short period of time. Within a month, they had decided to take her off to life support, and within a day, she passed away. And the other family, uh, even though the brothers of the woman who was ill, they said, we don't want her to suffer. Their daughter wasn't able to let go.
Mm.
She couldn't let her mom pass away. She felt like if she pulled that plug, it would be murder. And that was how she was processing that, right? And so it the, the whole thing is you want to start with intention. What is your intention in this place? If your intention is to be present, to be compassionate, to be kind, to be understanding, first to yourself and then to everyone else that's in the situation, including the person who possibly will pass away in a short period of time, then you're going to have that grounding to be able to deal with the situation in a loving way, in a kind way, in a compassionate way, in an understanding way, and even in a generous way, even if you don't agree with what a sibling is saying or what another family member is saying. You can understand that maybe you have the tools to deal with it, maybe your sibling does not. And you're going to have to just open up that space and allow them to be where they need to be. And and sometimes you have to, it's a part of the release, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to be able to release control of that because it's for the highest good of all, ultimately, right? So there's that element of it. If people can't if they're not willing to talk about it, then that you also have to respect that about people, because you certainly can't push anyone to talk about something that they're not willing to talk about. There may be cultural aspects. Wanda, you talked about the different faiths, the different kinds of, uh, you know, burials and different kinds of end of life rituals that people have. Uh, on another documentary I watched, it was really beautiful. They have the green funerals now,
Mhm.
where the families come together, and the people in the family actually um, dig the grave. They
Mhm.
like the, the funeral home will dig most of it, but they'll dig the rest of it, right? So that they can be a part of it. It's not a deep grave, it's a shallow grave. And then they put the person in together. Everyone is holding the body and they put it in. I mean, there's a lot of very beautiful rituals, the cardboard box one as well. So there's all kinds of now different ways also that people can be put to rest, right?
Mhm.
You may have an experience also where, if you're planning ahead for yourself, if you're not someone who is older, but you're, middle aged, or you're a little bit younger, where you want to talk about this stuff or you want to arrange that stuff, and your spouse or your partner is not willing to do that quite yet. That's another thing where you're going to step back, you're going to come forward again, then you're going to step back, and it's going to be a conversation. It's just about committing to that process of, this is something that we should talk about. This is something that we should take care of, especially if we have um, things together that need to be, you know, thought about after we pass away. Where is this going to go? Who's going to get this? Then these are things that definitely have to be discussed. You can also start the process on your own and wait for the other person whenever they're ready to catch up. Nobody says that you have to do absolutely everything together.
Mhm.
You can have something that's in place for yourself, and then when your partner is ready, then they can also put that together as well. So it's important, I think, to just start thinking about this from the two sides of the coin, which is the emotional side and also the practical side, and to find a way for those two things to be able to coexist in a way that feels good and feels right for you. And I also just want to finish off by talking about, in that time just after someone passes away, that there is no urgency for you to have to deal with something within the first day or
Mhm.
two or three. You can give yourself that space and time to take care of yourself, to deal with the shock of the loss. And even if it's an unexpected loss, it doesn't matter. You're still going to feel that shock. You're still going to feel that loss. So give yourself that time to process the grief of it before you start going to the business of it. It's not urgent for you to do that. Be Take care of yourself. If you have people around you that are saying a week later, they're saying, okay, well, it's
Mhm.
done, it's over. Like, why are you, like, that's kind of like an in one ear, out the other kind of
Mhm.
thing. It's just like, yeah, I appreciate your opinion. Thank you very much. And you just don't give it any energy that you don't need to, right? That's somebody that doesn't understand how to process things. That's somebody that doesn't, or not that they don't understand how to process things, but they've learned how to process something differently,
Mhm.
right? And maybe that's not what you need. Okay, and so it's okay to do that. It's also in the province of Ontario, you also have uh, bereavement leave that's available to you. You won't lose your job. You can take a leave period. It may have to be an unpaid period, but you can still take it. And that is a right that's accorded to you under the law. So you know that you have resources around you to support you as you go through a loss. And I think it's also very important, like you were saying earlier, Gwenda, that have your community around you, have your people around you, know that there are people that you can rely on to talk to support you, to come and even just sit with you, even when you can't say anything or you can't do anything. Just be there with you and for you. And if there's unresolved stuff, like you were saying about the casket, if you have some unresolved issues with a family member, and then you're taking that into the business of what you're doing, and instead of looking at something that's a reasonable cost for you, you decide to go to something that's much more extravagant and much bigger,
Mhm.
right? Then, think about the self-caring aspect. First of all, is this something that's self-caring that you're doing?
Mhm.
it's really to connect with your own emotions and to come to that place of understanding what's motivating you to do that. And if you do this, how is that going to impact you, right? Because the person that passed away is no longer there to see it,
Hmm.
right? So, and would they want that for you also?
Hmm.
Would they want you to take on an additional suffering in this period because you have some unresolved issues with them?
Hmm.
Remember, there's all kinds of ways to resolve things for yourself, because even in relationships now where the person is still here, if you're not able to resolve it with them, if you're able to find a resolution in yourself, then you're providing healing for yourself. You're taking care of yourself. You're doing self-caring work. And that allows you that space to make decisions from a more practical and a more reasonable point of view than allowing yourself to really operate from a purely emotional and perhaps guilt or grief or resentment or anger or what have you, that kind of place. You know, it gives you that latitude to be able to operate from your true self, your true nature, your inner knowledge, and your inner wisdom. And always that's what we want to be cultivating, is that connection with ourselves, connection with whatever our higher power is, if we believe in one, so that we make decisions that are aligned with who we are.
Absolutely. Oh, that's beautiful. And it's actually a perfect segue. I do have one little thing, because the one thing that we didn't talk about is children. Not necessarily children passing, but a lot of times when it comes to children, young children, we try not to have them involved because we don't, there can be age appropriate language that's used. And I know that when my brother-in-law's father passed away, my niece was maybe 4 years old. My God, I think she was 4 or 5 maybe. And so I sat down with her and it's like, okay, well, let's get a book and let's write down the memories that you have. Because at that age, you're not necessarily going to remember, but it was heartwarming because she wrote down these memories. And then when she was at the funeral, she would go up to people and because children, they're children. They just look at life in this, beautiful, view of life. Not that they can't be sad, but they're like, oh, see this story. This is when I was planting tomatoes with my vovua, and then and people, they would start crying, but they also loved it because that's the whole thing. If you look at it, the Irish with the wake, it's the same thing. I'm sharing a story. I'm having something that allows those people to stay alive in our hearts. And so even if we and this is something that I would recommend even at this point. If there's a relationship in your life that is contentious, you can even sometimes start a writing prompt with that in mind. Like, if you were to be gone today, how do I feel about that? And then, the funny thing is, as you mentioned, Aisha, when we heal, the world heals. So when we get closer to that loving place, you also don't have as many expectations of those people. That's not an easy thing to do. But yet, grief is not just that that person is not there. Grief can be about the type of relationship that you had. And maybe it wasn't the Hallmark, movie kind of thing. And you wished for more. And so how much of that is them just being who they were and you not being able to accept them where they are? And I talked about that a little bit before about, just because they're on their deathbed doesn't mean they're going to radically change. Although that does happen. You do get statements, forgiveness type statements. But the other thing that you were talking about as well was getting the community support. And our guest next week, her name's Tracy Ogilvie McDonald, and she is what's called a death doula, which there's birth doulas. And what happens with birth doulas is that they help women, families, prepare for a birth, usually at home or whatever. They manage the emotions around the experience, all that. Well, a death doula is the same type of thing. whether there's vigil, like somebody, so sitting vigil with somebody is like when they're in the last throes of the experience, they sit with you. She's also a hospice worker. She's a grief recovery specialist. And we're going to ask her next week, you know, how she got into this field, and some of the wonderful experiences that you get being able to hold this space for families in such a way. And the basic thing, as I mentioned again last week, was that you know, my mom didn't talk about that she was dying until she was in front of strangers, because it's easier for us to talk to strangers or somebody that's not emotionally connected to us than it is to talk to that daughter or that son or that brother or sister that you're emotionally attached to, right? Because you still have to be able to burst that bubble of having that initial conversation. So while it's all great and good for me to encourage this, I was also blessed to have this upbringing. You know, or at least the fact that it's a common conversation. It doesn't make it any easier. So next week we are going to have Tracy with us. If there's a question that you want of Tracy, we are going to basically do it, because as you know, we just talk here. We start with a conversation. We have a basic idea of where we're going, and then it's really up to you. So if you had certain questions that you wanted to ask, or if there's anything further that you want to know about what we've talked about, I know that Ayesha's doing this beautiful challenge that goes for the year, and it's really quite interesting because it's a whole body experience, mind, body, and spirit. It's not just like a 5-day challenge. It's like a take time to get to know yourself kind of thing. And how do you move your body? How do you respect your body? So, because anything that we do that moves towards self-love helps the world, because we're not going into the world with our light dimmed. And it's not, some of these are sounding cliche because everybody's using this kind of language, but it is, when it comes to being able to deal with highly emotional times, I mean, times that are going to be emotional. And the one thing too, the one thing that I just want to say before I ask for your final thoughts is, again, with children, because we did have somebody ask about children. This is the whole thing, is we don't know, we don't have a best before date for any of our relationships, but you can be guaranteed that every single relationship you have on this plane at some point in time will end in the way, in its image to you, right? So that's the one thing. If it's a small child, they're going to grow up, they're going to become teenagers and not want to talk to you, and then they're going to go off to college or university or just move out of the house. Or do you know what I mean? Or maybe the relationship you have with your spouse is going to change because it goes from just you two to children and a family, and then after that it goes back to, oh my god, it's just us, do we still like each other? So there's, you know, I mean, that's the whole thing about grief, because grief is at the bottom of this. Do we stop? And this is the other thing, is it doesn't really matter the relationship you have with those people that were close with you, especially at the beginning of life. When you hear that, it's going to send you for a loop. Even if it's like, you know, your old high school teacher that you hear because somebody talks about, and you go, oh, and then all of a sudden you're back in high school and there's memories. And if anything, by using things like the memory book, whether you're a child, whether you're an adult, to be able to say, who are the people that made a difference in my life? And how can I remember them clearly from love, and work through whatever else is there that's blocking me from seeing them as anything other than doing the best that they can. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
that's what we look forward to next week. Ayesha, closing thoughts?
I think we've really covered everything. I think, you know, just be in yourself, be in your body, be in your heart, be present, be self-aware, and trust that you're going to be able to get through it.
And I love the fact that you said that this experience has helped you, just because sometimes it's just saying the words out loud changes things, because we're giving it space, right?
Well, I would add to that, you know, this is, excuse me, this is a safe space for me.
Mm,
Like being with you and talking about this stuff has been healing because you created this very safe space and healing space for me to be able to explore this and for me to know that if there was anything that came up for me that I could always talk to you and I could always check in with you. And that has been just such a gift. And I will always, always be grateful and love you even more for giving me the space to deal with something that has just been a challenge for me throughout my life. I feel like I finally connected with the idea of life cycle without fear
mm,
and um, without anxiety, without uh, resistance. You know, you've given me that space. You created
mm.
that space for us to talk about this in a safe space. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I love you so
Thank
much.
you. I
Thank you.
love you. I love you. So here we go. This was another long one because these are not light topics, but so please join us next week, 7 o'clock. Tracy Ogilvy McDonald will be our guest. It's our first guest star, our guest host, guest. I don't know what to say, you know. And then just so after next week is our last with death and dying, and then we're going on to a fabulous topic again for the month of March, which is going to be discernment.
Yes, that's right.
Sorry, I thought for a second
Not
that
all about that. Oh my God. I'm like, what are we doing next?
yeah. We actually
It's
do. We
discernment. Yeah,
talked a little bit about this, but then that was like a month ago. Like,
I
so
know.
this has
Yeah.
been a heavy couple of months. This has been a heavy couple of
Yeah.
weeks.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, okay, we look forward to seeing you next week. Aisha, I
Yeah.
love you. I love this.
Love you.
I love this.
Love
I
you, babe. Thank you.
love just talking with you. There's always, the conversation always goes somewhere interesting.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
You and if there's anything, and I encourage you all, again, I put the link in when I post these videos. Join up because Aisha's challenge has only been February so far, right? Like
Yeah, it's only been
just coming up into
February.
March, and it's
That's
really
right.
quite an interesting take on the normal challenge. And it's really you know, because this is the thing, life does not take 5 seconds to change. You know, it
Yeah.
takes a concerted effort, it takes self-love, self-compassion, and then all of a sudden, like, you know, like the spring comes and the thing bursts through the ground and all of a sudden we have a plant. That's what we're
Yeah.
doing here. She's
That's
planting
it.
some good
That's it.
seed. So
Yeah.
again, join us next week, 7 o'clock, right here, and we'll see you then. Okay,
Yeah. Okay. Let's love everyone. Thank you.
take care. Yay.